In the kingdom of Lothfeld, nestled in the shadow of the cursed Wormspire Mountains, there was a ruler like no other man whose name still haunts the stories of the land. King Alaric. His reign began as all others do, filled with hope, promises, and the scent of fresh ambition. But hope would soon turn to dread. For King Alaric harbored a dark, unspoken ritual, one that defied nature and shattered the boundaries between man and beast. Each morning, before the sun broke through the mist, Alaric performed an act so vile, so unnatural, that it became the kingdom's most whispered secret. He would sit alone at the head of a long, decaying wooden table, and, with a cruel smile, he would consume what no man should, live spiders. Not just any spiders. These were creatures of the darkest caves beneath Wormspire, breed with legs that trembled like thread in the wind, eyes that reflected the void. King Alaric believed their venomous bite could grant him power, a strength beyond mortal men. He did not eat them for sustenance. No, he ate them for something far darker. He ate them for the power he could draw from their suffering. The anguish in their final moments, he believed, would transfer to him, infusing him with the strength to bend the kingdom to his will. At first, it seemed like a harmless eccentricity, a strange habit of a ruler whose wealth and power were unparalleled. But soon, things began to change. Unseen forces stirred beneath the earth. Crops failed. Rivers ran dry. Children fell ill with a sickness that no physician could cure. Alaric's obsession grew, as did the kingdom's decay. He had no idea, no inkling that each spider, each venomous creature he consumed, was a tether to something far older, far darker than any man could understand. One fateful morning, a curse was born, and with it, the kingdom's undoing. It all began on a quiet morning in the year of the blood moon. The court had gathered for their usual morning feast, though the dishes were mostly untouched. The nobles, their once glamorous attire now faded and worn, exchanged wary glances as they tried to avoid King Alaric's piercing gaze. There were whispers, of course, whispers about the spiders. Lady Helene, the king's most trusted advisor, had grown increasingly concerned. She had long noticed the change in the king, how his eyes had darkened, how his temper had grown erratic. His appetite for the spiders seemed insatiable. His skin grew pale and fevered. His hands shook, yet his eyes gleamed with an almost unnatural fervor. "Your Majesty," Lady Helene said one morning, her voice laced with hesitation, "perhaps it's time we consider stopping the ritual, just for a time, for your health." Alaric's eyes locked onto her. There was no warmth in his gaze, no trace of the man who had once been kind, only the cold gleam of a ruler teetering on the edge of madness. "You think I am weak?" he growled. His voice was low, like a growl from the throat of some unseen predator. "Do you think I am like the others, a mere mortal who succumbs to time? No, I shall not be weakened by the petty concerns of your doctors and priests. The spiders give me power, and power is all that matters." Helene swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing upon her. She had witnessed the king's changes firsthand, his body withering, his mind fracturing, and the unsettling way his hands trembled as he plucked the spiders from their cages. They wriggled and writhed, desperate to escape. But there was no escape from Alaric's twisted obsession. As the first rays of light pierced the castle's grim walls, Alaric made his way to the grand dining hall. He sat at the head of the table, his eyes focused on the small glass jar that sat before him. Inside were the spiders, 10 in total. Their legs brushed against the glass, moving in frantic patterns. They were already doomed. Helene stood at a distance, her heart heavy in her chest. She watched as Alaric picked up the jar and twisted its lid. The sound of the metal scraping echoed through the silent hall. His gaze was fixed on the spiders, hypnotic, as if he were preparing for a sacred ritual rather than a grotesque act of consumption. He tipped the jar over, letting the spiders spill onto the table. With unnatural calm, Alaric selected the largest one, a black, hairy creature, its fangs glinting in the dim light. It struggled, but it was futile. With a sudden, swift motion, Alaric brought it to his lips. The spider's body crunched between his teeth, its venom seeping into his flesh. He closed his eyes, savoring the sensation, the rush of power that coursed through his veins. But that day, something went wrong. A tremor ran through the king's body, a strange, convulsing spasm that left him gasping for breath. His face contorted with pain, his eyes wild with terror. The spider's venom, it seemed, was more potent than he had anticipated. Alaric collapsed from his throne, his body writhing as if under the weight of some unseen force. Helene rushed forward, panic rising in her chest. "Your Majesty," she cried, but it was too late. His body began to twitch violently, his limbs jerking in unnatural angles. His skin turned an ashen shade, and his mouth foamed with froth. And then, just as quickly as it began, the tremors stopped. The king lay still. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. His eyes flickered open, but something was different. There was an emptiness in his gaze, a hollow look that sent chills down Lady Helene's spine. Alaric stood slowly, his movements deliberate. The air around him seemed colder, darker. He turned to the nobles gathered in the hall, his voice a low, eerie whisper. "We have unleashed something, my dear subjects," he said, his words sending a ripple of unease through the room. "The spiders have given me more than power. They have shown me something. A power beyond this kingdom, beyond this world." The nobles recoiled, unsure of what they were hearing. But they had no idea at all that this was only the beginning. As the days stretched on, the kingdom of Lothfeld found itself caught in a strange and terrifying silence. The air grew still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The crops, once bountiful and lush, withered and died under a sun that seemed dimmer than before. Rivers that had once sung through the land now ran dry, their beds cracked and desolate. The skies, once a deep and rich blue, turned to a sickly, oppressive grey. It wasn't long before the sickness began to spread. At first, it was just a few cases. The farmers in the eastern valleys, men and women known for their hard labor, fell ill with a fever unlike any they had experienced before. Their bodies grew pale, their eyes sunken, their breath shallow. They were weak, their skin blotched with dark splotches that pulsed with fever. The physicians tried everything they could, but none of their herbs, potions, or prayers seemed to make a difference. Then it spread to the town. In the bustling market square, people collapsed in the streets, their bodies twitching and contorting, as if caught in the throes of some ancient, forgotten curse. The townsfolk looked to each other in terror, their once lively faces now drawn and fearful, as the sickness claimed more and more lives with each passing day. And still, the king remained silent. Lady Helene, growing more desperate with each passing hour, knew she had to act. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on the entire kingdom, and she feared it would not be long before it claimed them all. She had once been the king's most trusted advisor, but she now found herself questioning his motives. She had seen his madness grow in the wake of his strange habit, had felt the dark change in his aura since the first spider had met his lips. What if the spiders, the creatures he had consumed for so long, were not simply granting him power, but also unleashing something far darker? A power older than the kingdom itself, a malevolent force that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting to be awakened. Her fears were realized when she ventured into the king's private chambers that evening, her heart pounding in her chest. Alaric was seated at his dark oak desk, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. His hands trembled, but not from illness, no. They trembled with excitement. "Helene," he said, his voice thick with an eerie calm, The sickness is not an accident. It is the beginning, a reckoning, if you will. The spiders have revealed it to me, a power that no mortal can control, but I will wield it. I will rule the kingdom and beyond. Helene's heart sank as the king's words twisted through her thoughts like a snake. She could see it now, how the sickness, the drought, the decay were all tied together. The spiders had not merely granted Alaric power, they had opened a gateway, a door to something ancient and monstrous. "We must stop this," she whispered. But Alaric merely laughed, a dry, rasping sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "It's too late for that, Lady Helene," he said. "The curse has already been set in motion, and it will claim everything in its path." The next morning, the king was gone. His absence was felt immediately, like a shadow falling over the entire castle. Helene searched desperately for him, but it was as if he had disappeared into the very air itself, leaving only a lingering, acrid stench of decay behind. Days turned to weeks. The sickness worsened, spreading like wildfire through every village, every hamlet, every town. People spoke in hushed tones of dark figures seen in the fog at night, of whispers carried on the wind, of shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Some said they had seen Alaric, his pale face gaunt, his eyes hollow roaming the land, his skin almost translucent, a shadow of the man he once was. But the king was no longer human. Alaric had become something else. He had merged with the very venom he had consumed, his body altered by the dark power he had sought to control. His once great mind, once brilliant and calculating, had fractured under the weight of his obsession. He was no longer a man who could be reasoned with. He was a vessel for something ancient, something unstoppable. The plague he had unleashed did not stop with the people. It spread to the land itself. The forests grew twisted and dark, their trees gnarled and lifeless. The rivers ran with blackened water, and the earth itself seemed to recoil in pain, as if crying out for release. And still, Alaric watched from the shadows, his hunger for power insatiable. As the kingdom's suffering deepened, rumors began to circulate about the true source of the curse, rumors of a long-forgotten bloodline, one that had once ruled the lands beneath Wormspire, the ancient line of the Hesperides, a family said to have made pacts with dark forces in exchange for power. Helene, desperate to find a way to end the plague, began her own investigation into the history of the kingdom. She had known the Hesperides were no mere myth, but she had never truly understood their connection to the royal family until now. It was said that the last of the Hesperides had died out centuries ago, but now, with Alaric's descent into madness, she feared their blood had never truly left. Her research led her deep into the bowels of the castle, where an old, dusty library held secrets that had been buried for generations. There, hidden among the forgotten tomes, she found what she was looking for, a journal written by the very first king of Lothfeld, a man named Eldred the Bold. The journal spoke of a dark pact made with a shadowy figure known only as the Weeping One, a being said to dwell beneath the Wormspire mountains, feeding of the fear and suffering of mortals. The king had traded the lives of his bloodline in exchange for power, an act that would bind his descendants to the cursed forces beneath the earth. Alaric was the last of the Hesperides bloodline. His obsession with the spiders, with their venom and their bite, had awakened something that should have remained dormant. The king's ritual had opened the gate to the Weeping One, an entity whose hunger could not be satisfied by mere mortals. Helene was left with a terrible choice: stop Alaric and risk plunging the kingdom further into darkness, or let the plague continue and watch her people suffer. But she knew, deep down, that there was no stopping the curse now. It had already begun, and its end would come only with the death of the king, or perhaps something far worse. The days that followed Alaric's disappearance were not days of respite. They were days of further madness, of a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Lady Helene continued to search for answers, but each step she took only seemed to lead her deeper into the labyrinth of the kingdom's doomed fate. In her mind, a single thought gnawed at her: Alaric had to be stopped. But how? How could one man be defeated when he was no longer fully human? How could she, a mere woman, stand against the unnatural power that now thrived within him? Alaric's presence was still felt in every corner of the kingdom, as if his very essence had become a plague in itself. The whispers of the courtiers had turned to frantic wails. The nobles, once high and proud, now cowered in their castles, unable to leave their walls for fear of what roamed outside. They spoke of seeing Alaric's shadow in the distance, stalking them in the fog, his eyes glowing with a cold, predatory hunger. The kingdom had descended into chaos. The sickness spread like wildfire. People dropped dead in the streets, their bodies racked with the same convulsions Alaric had suffered. And yet, despite it all, the king had not been seen. Not once. It was then that Helene received word from the distant town of Lothfeld, rumors that sent chills racing down her spine. A survivor, a poor farmer, had seen Alaric on the night of the full moon. The king had appeared at the village's edge, his body trembling with the power of the curse, his mouth agape in a grotesque rictus grin. But it wasn't Alaric alone. He had been accompanied by something far worse, a towering, monstrous creature. Its form was that of a spider, but it was far larger than anything Helene had ever seen. Its legs stretched and clicked against the stone, its black, glossy body moving with terrifying grace. Atop its back sat the king himself, his face hollow, his eyes gleaming with madness. The creature had been a living nightmare, a grotesque vision of a spider god born from the venom Alaric had consumed for years, a servant of the ancient Weeping One. Lady Helene could no longer deny the truth. The Weeping One, the ancient entity that had forged the pact with Eldred the Bold, had been awakened, and it had taken possession of Alaric. His hunger was not just for power, it was for souls, millions of them. The king was no longer the man she had once known. He was a vessel for something far darker, a conduit for the plague that had ravaged the land. And now, it seemed, he was preparing to fulfill the prophecy. She had to act quickly. The journey to the Wormspire Mountains was treacherous. The land was no longer the same. It had become a desolate wasteland, where once vibrant meadows now lay barren, the earth cracked and lifeless. The winds carried a stench of rot, as if the land itself was dying. Even the birds had stopped singing. Lady Helene, along with a small group of soldiers loyal to her, made their way to the heart of the mountains. They carried with them only the faint hope that they might find Alaric, or what remained of him, and put an end to the plague once and for all. The journey was long, and the closer they came to the Wormspire, the more the atmosphere grew oppressive. The mountains loomed over them like silent sentinels, their peaks jagged and sharp, cutting through the grey clouds. There was no escape from the shadow of the Weeping One. As they reached the entrance to the cursed caves, Lady Helene felt a chill run through her bones. This was it. This was where the final confrontation would take place. The soldiers followed her into the dark, their torches flickering weakly against the suffocating gloom. The air was thick with an unnatural dampness, the walls slick with moisture. The deeper they ventured, the more the air seemed to hum with an energy that made their skin crawl. Finally, they reached the cavern where it all began, the ancient site where Eldred the Bold had made his pact, where the bloodline of the Hesperides had sealed its fate. Alaric stood at the center of the cavern, his form a twisted, gnarled figure. His body was no longer recognizable, his skin stretched tight over his bones, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling power, as if he were not seeing the world around him, but instead seeing through it, to something far beyond. But it was not Alaric that Helene feared now. It was the creature beside him, the giant spider, its form pulsating with dark energy. The Weeping One had manifested itself in the physical world, and its presence was suffocating. The cavern itself seemed to writhe with malevolent energy, the stone trembling beneath their feet. Helene stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her heart. "Alaric, you must stop this," she said. "You have to let go. The kingdom is dying. You're killing everything." Alaric's lips parted in a twisted smile. "The kingdom, Helene, I have given them everything they could ever need. Power, immortality, they are all mine. And now, I will take the world beyond." His words were cold, detached, as if spoken by something not entirely human. He raised his hand, and the creature stirred, its many legs clicking against the stone. Helene had no choice. She rushed forward, brandishing the sword she had taken from one of the fallen soldiers. The air around her thickened, as if the very atmosphere was pushing back against her. "Alaric, please," she screamed, but it was too late. The Weeping One surged forward, its massive legs striking like lightning. The battle that followed was like no other. The cavern shook with the weight of the cursed power that filled it. Alaric's voice echoed of the walls, but Helene's resolve did not falter. With a final, desperate cry, she drove the sword into Alaric's chest, through the very heart of the curse. The cavern went still. The Weeping One let out a howl that shook the stone, then crumbled into nothingness. Alaric's body fell, lifeless. The curse had been lifted, but as Helene gazed upon the ruins of the kingdom, she knew the true cost. The plague had been stopped, but the land would never be the same. It was too late for redemption. The horrors had been unleashed, and the world would remember the price of Alaric's obsession forever. When Helene returned to the kingdom, she found it in ruins. The plague had taken more than half the population, and the land was scarred. There were no celebrations, no rejoicing, only the silent grief of a people left to rebuild their shattered lives. Alaric's legacy was a curse, one that would live on in the whispers of the survivors. His obsession, his madness had consumed not just him, but the entire kingdom. The kingdom of Lothfeld would never rise again. It would remain a shadow of its former self, haunted by the spectre of its fallen king. But even as the kingdom crumbled, there was one question that lingered, unanswered. Was Alaric truly the last of the Hesperides bloodline? Or had his curse merely found a new vessel? For as long as the winds howled through the Wormspire Mountains, there would always be the lingering fear that something darker yet remained, something tied to the ancient pact waiting for the right moment to rise again. Years passed since the fall of King Alaric, and the kingdom of Lothfeld slowly, agonizingly, began to recover. The plague had faded, and the land had begun to heal, but the scars of the past would never be erased. What had once been a proud and flourishing realm had become a mere shadow of itself, a place haunted by memories, the stories of a mad king and the terrible price of his ambition. Lady Helene had lived to see the end of it all, but she had not lived unscathed. The weight of her actions, the heavy cost of her decisions, would follow her to her dying day. She had stopped the curse, yes. She had saved the kingdom, perhaps. But she had lost everything in the process, the trust of those who had once supported her, the peace she had hoped to restore, and ultimately, her own sense of self. The castle stood as a silent witness to it all. It was no longer the grand, intimidating fortress it once had been. It was a ruin, a crumbling shell, its walls overrun with ivy, its towers leaning precariously against time's cruel hand. Yet, despite its decayed state, there was still something oppressive about it, something that whispered of past horrors. On the day Helene visited the castle for what she swore would be the last time, the air felt thick, laden with the kind of stillness that seems to hold its breath waiting for something to break. She wandered through the dark halls, her steps echoing on the stone floors. She was alone, as she had always been, but she felt, watched. A presence, familiar and suffocating, lingered in the air. She could feel it at the back of her neck, the same feeling she had gotten in the final moments before Alaric had died, when the cavern had trembled and the very world seemed to tear apart. She reached the old dining hall, the very same room where Alaric had indulged in his twisted feast of spiders, and paused before the long, withered table. There were no servants here now, no banquet to attend, only the remnants of a past long gone. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something rotten. Suddenly, she heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to stop her heart cold. The sound of clicking, a soft, rhythmic sound that echoed through the room like a distant memory. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows, her hand trembling at her side. And there it was, a single spider crawling across the floor, its legs clicking softly against the stone. A black, glistening creature, its eyes reflecting the dim light as it moved with eerie precision. Helene stepped back, her pulse quickening, the air around her growing colder by the second. The spider stopped, and then, with a sickening lurch, it grew. Its body expanded, its legs stretching out as though the very air around it fed its growth. Within moments, it was no longer a simple arachnid, it was a towering, monstrous thing, its size enough to fill the room, its many eyes gleaming with the same malevolent glow Helene had once seen in Alaric's gaze. The creature had returned. For a long moment, they stared at each other, Helene and the spider, and then, as if compelled by some ancient force, the creature moved toward her, its legs tapping against the stone like the footsteps of death itself. In the depths of her heart, Helene knew the truth. The curse had never truly ended. It had merely slumbered, waiting for its time to rise again. The Weeping One's influence had never fully left. It had only passed from one vessel to another. As the creature loomed above her, its jaws parting in a grotesque grin, the whispers returned. The same whispers she had heard on that fateful night when she had defeated Alaric. They had never gone away. They had been waiting for the bloodline to return. Helene had thought the curse was broken, but it was not. It had merely shifted, taking root in the shadows once again, as it had done centuries before. The bloodline of the Hesperides was not truly gone. It was only lying in wait, and now it had found its new vessel. The creature's fangs gleamed as it closed in, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the spider stopped. Its eyes seemed to focus on Helene, almost as if it was studying her, deciding her fate. The room grew still once more, the clicking of its legs fading into the background. The creature's presence was almost patient, as if it were biding its time. Helene stood motionless, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the ancient pact, the curse, the very forces that had shaped the kingdom's fate and led them to this moment. And then, in a sudden, almost imperceptible shift, the creature turned. It scuttled back toward the shadows, disappearing into the darkness of the castle's ruined halls. The air grew still once again. The silence was deafening. For a long moment, Helene didn't move. She couldn't. She was frozen in place, her heart racing in her chest as the implications of what had just happened began to settle in. The curse had returned. The Weeping One had claimed another vessel. The bloodline of the Hesperides was not gone. It had merely been waiting, and now the kingdom of Lothfeld was doomed to repeat the same cycle it had always known. The plague, the madness, the hunger, it would rise again. There was no escaping it. As Helene turned and left the ruins of the castle behind, she understood some curses were not meant to be broken. They were only meant to return. And so the kingdom would fall once more, as it had before,